The air inside the Military Assistance Command headquarters hung thick with humidity and cigarette smoke. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, barely moving the heat that pressed down on everything like a wet blanket. Maps covered every wall, pins and colored strings marking positions, movements, infiltration routes. To an outsider, it looked like the organized chaos of a winning war. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann stood near one of those maps, his finger tracing a line along the Cambodian border. His jaw was tight. His eyes, hollow from sleepless nights, moved across the terrain features he knew better than most generals in Washington. He had been in Vietnam since 1962. He had seen what the press releases never mentioned. He had buried friends whose deaths appeared nowhere in the optimistic reports sent back to the Pentagon. Behind him, a young captain shuffled papers, preparing the weekly briefing that would eventually reach the Secretary of Defense. The numbers on those papers told a story of progress. Enemy killed in action, weapons captured, villages secured. The metrics of victory, neatly typed and ready for presentation. Vann didn't turn around. He simply asked, his voice low and tired, "How many of those numbers are real?" The captain hesitated. In that hesitation lived the entire tragedy of the Vietnam War. What John Paul Vann understood in that moment, what dozens of field commanders across South Vietnam had come to realize through months and years of combat, was a truth so dangerous that speaking it aloud could end a career. The United States military, the most powerful armed force in human history, was not winning in Vietnam. More than that, it could not win. Not with the strategy being employed, not with the political constraints in place, not against an enemy willing to absorb casualties that would have broken any Western nation. But this truth could not be spoken. Not in Saigon, not in Washington, not in the press briefings that painted pictures of steady progress and light at the end of the tunnel. The machinery of optimism had grown too large, too invested, too politically necessary to accommodate doubt. The silence that followed Vann's question filled the room like smoke from a distant fire. The captain returned to his papers. The fans continued their slow rotation. And somewhere in the jungle, men on both sides prepared to die for a war that some already knew could not be won. This is the story of that silence. The story of American officers who saw the truth with their own eyes, who documented it in reports that were ignored or buried, who watched as the gap between reality and official narrative grew into a chasm that would eventually swallow over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese. It is the story of institutional failure, of career calculations trumping battlefield honesty, of a military culture that punished pessimism and rewarded the appearance of success. It is the story of how the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever assembled could not overcome the human tendency to hear only what confirms existing beliefs. And it begins not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the air-conditioned conference rooms where truth went to die. The year was 1962 when the first significant American military advisors arrived in South Vietnam. The mission seemed straightforward. Train and equip the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to defeat a communist insurgency supported by North Vietnam. American advisors would provide expertise, equipment, and limited combat support. South Vietnamese forces would do the fighting. Victory, according to the initial assessments, was a matter of time and resources. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann arrived in March of that year, assigned as senior advisor to the ARVN 7th Division in the Mekong Delta. He was 47 years old, a decorated Korean War veteran, and possessed of an intensity that made subordinates nervous and superiors uncomfortable. He asked questions that others preferred to leave unasked. He went places that advisors were supposed to avoid. He talked to Vietnamese farmers, Buddhist monks, and captured Viet Cong prisoners, learning their perspectives on a war that American commanders understood primarily through maps and statistics. What Van discovered in those first months disturbed him profoundly. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was not the professional force described in official assessments. Its officer corps was riddled with political appointees, whose promotions depended more on loyalty to the Saigon government than combat effectiveness. Corruption was endemic, with commanders padding payrolls with ghost soldiers whose salaries went into private pockets. Equipment disappeared into black markets. Intelligence was unreliable, often fabricated to tell superiors what they wanted to hear. More troubling still was the nature of the enemy. The Viet Cong were not the disorganized bands of guerrillas depicted in American briefings. They were disciplined, motivated, and deeply embedded in the rural population. They moved through villages with an ease that suggested support, or at least acquiescence, from the peasants who lived there. They appeared, attacked, and vanished before superior firepower could be brought to bear. They fought not for territory but for time, understanding that their enemy was constrained by political calendars and public patience in ways they were not. Van began documenting what he saw. His reports were detailed, honest, and deeply pessimistic about the current trajectory of the war. He described ARVN commanders who refused to engage the enemy, preferring to call in airstrikes on empty jungle rather than risk casualties that might damage their careers. He reported on the alienation of the rural population, driven toward the Viet Cong by corrupt officials and indiscriminate violence. He warned that the metrics being used to measure progress, body counts, and weapons captured and villages controlled were fundamentally misleading. These reports traveled up the chain of command. They reached Saigon, then Washington, and they disappeared into the institutional silence that would define American involvement in Vietnam. The problem was not that Van's superiors disagreed with his assessments. Many of them privately shared his concerns. The problem was that the entire American military structure in Vietnam was invested in demonstrating progress. Careers depended on it. Budgets depended on it. The Kennedy administration's credibility in the Cold War depended on it. There was no mechanism for incorporating pessimism into a system designed to produce optimism. General Paul Harkins, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had assured Washington that the war would be won by Christmas 1963. This timeline was not based on battlefield realities, but on political necessity. The American public, the Congress, and the President needed to believe that the sacrifices being made were leading somewhere. Admitting doubt meant admitting that those sacrifices might be in vain. So the reports that contradicted the narrative were filed away. The officers who wrote them were transferred, passed over for promotion, or encouraged to moderate their assessments. The system did not require explicit orders to suppress dissent. It simply made dissent professionally fatal. On January 2, 1963, the truth that Van had been documenting collided violently with the official narrative at a small village called Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta. The battle began as a routine operation. Intelligence indicated a Viet Cong radio transmitter was operating near the village. ARVN forces, heavily supported by American helicopters and armored personnel carriers, moved to engage what was expected to be a small enemy force. Van was present as an advisor, watching from an observation aircraft as the operation unfolded. What happened next was a disaster that revealed everything wrong with the American approach to the war. The Viet Cong force was not small. It was a reinforced battalion, dug into fortified positions with clear fields of fire. When American helicopters approached, they were met with disciplined anti-aircraft fire. 5 helicopters went down in the first minutes of the engagement. ARVN commanders, rather than pressing the attack, hesitated. They called for more airstrikes. They waited for reinforcements. They did everything except close with the enemy. Van, watching from above, screamed into his radio, begging ARVN commanders to advance. He landed his aircraft under fire to coordinate the attack personally. Nothing worked. The ARVN division, despite massive advantages in firepower and mobility, allowed the Viet Cong to hold their positions throughout the day and slip away under cover of darkness. The Battle of Ap Bac should have been a turning point. It demonstrated, in brutal clarity, that the strategy of advising and supporting ARVN forces was not working. The South Vietnamese army was not becoming an effective fighting force. The enemy was stronger, better led, and more committed than the official assessments acknowledged. Everything Van had been reporting for months was confirmed in a single day of combat. Instead, the opposite happened. General Harkins declared Ap Bac a victory. His reasoning: the ARVN had eventually occupied the battlefield after the enemy withdrew. By the metrics that mattered to Washington, territory had been gained, enemy casualties had been inflicted, and the operation had achieved its objective. That the Viet Cong had fought a force 10 times their size to a standstill, that they had escaped with their unit intact, that they had demonstrated the impotence of American tactical superiority, these facts did not fit the narrative and therefore did not exist in official reports. Van was furious. He gave interviews to American journalists, describing what had actually happened at Ap Bac. His honesty made him a hero to the press corps and an enemy to his superiors. Within months, he was effectively forced out of Vietnam. His tour ended early, his career trajectory interrupted. The message to other officers was clear. Honesty about the war's progress was career suicide. The institution would not tolerate assessments that contradicted the approved narrative. Whatever doubts existed, they would remain private, spoken only in whispers among trusted colleagues, never committed to paper, never transmitted up the chain of command. And so the silence deepened. The gap between what officers knew and what they reported widened month by month. The war continued, the casualties mounted, and the official progress continued its steady march toward a victory that would never come. In the years that followed Ap Bac, the American commitment to Vietnam expanded dramatically. What had been an advisory mission became a full-scale combat operation. By 1965, over 180,000 American troops were deployed in country. By 1968, that number would exceed 500,000. Billions of dollars in equipment flowed into South Vietnam. The most advanced military technology in the world was brought to bear against an enemy that moved on foot through jungle trails. And still, the officers who understood the fundamental problems remained silent. It was not that they lacked courage. Many of these men had proven their bravery in combat. They had led soldiers into firefights, called in airstrikes on their own positions, made decisions under fire that saved lives and achieved objectives. Physical courage was not the issue. The silence was institutional, structural, built into the very fabric of how the American military operated. The system rewarded optimism and punished doubt. Promotion boards looked for officers who accomplished missions, who reported progress, who solved problems rather than identified them. An officer who consistently reported that his area of operation was deteriorating, that the enemy was growing stronger, that the strategy was fundamentally flawed, was an officer who would never command a battalion, never wear a general's stars, never have his voice heard in the councils where decisions were made. More than career considerations, there was the weight of personal investment. Men who had lost friends in combat could not easily accept that those deaths had been meaningless. Officers who had devoted years of their lives to the war needed to believe that their sacrifices had purpose. The psychological cost of acknowledging failure was enormous, and the human mind has remarkable capacity for self-deception when the alternative is despair. The silence had many forms. There was the silence of reports that omitted inconvenient facts. There was the silence of briefings that emphasized successes and glossed over failures. There was the silence of officers who nodded along in meetings, concealing their doubts behind professional demeanor. And there was the silence of those who did speak up, only to watch their warnings disappear into the bureaucratic void. Some tried to break through, some documented the truth in reports that were classified, buried, or simply ignored. Some spoke to journalists, risking their careers to get the truth before the American public. Some resigned in protest, walking away from the institution they had served rather than continuing to participate in what they saw as a catastrophic deception. But the machinery of official optimism was too powerful. The reporting system, designed to flow information upward, had become a mechanism for filtering reality into acceptable fiction. Each level of command smoothed the rough edges, removed the discordant notes, presented a picture slightly more positive than the one received. By the time assessments reached Washington, they bore little resemblance to the situation on the ground. This is the tragedy at the heart of Vietnam. Not that America's leaders were evil or stupid, but that they were trapped in a system that made truth invisible. The silence of the officers who knew was not conspiracy, but culture, not plot, but institutional momentum. And that made it all the more deadly. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These are the stories that reveal what history books often hide, the uncomfortable truths that shape the world we live in today. Subscribe now, because understanding the past is the only way to avoid repeating it. The Pentagon, spring of 1967. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara sat in his seventh-floor office, surrounded by the tools of modern warfare: computers, data analysts, systems engineers. This was the man who had revolutionized the Ford Motor Company with statistical management, who believed that any problem could be solved with enough information and the right metrics. He had brought this philosophy to the Department of Defense, and he had applied it to Vietnam. On his desk lay the latest reports from Saigon. The numbers were encouraging. Enemy casualties continued to mount. The crossover point, that moment when communist losses would exceed their ability to replace them, seemed imminent. The body count ratio, American and ARVN forces were killing the enemy at a rate of 10-1, even higher in some operations. By any quantitative measure, the United States was winning the war. What the numbers did not show was what John Paul Vann and dozens of other field officers had been trying to communicate for years. The body counts were unreliable, inflated by commanders under pressure to demonstrate progress. The crossover point was a mathematical fantasy because North Vietnam's population and its willingness to absorb casualties far exceeded anything the Pentagon's models anticipated. The metrics measured activity, not achievement. They counted the dead, but could not account for the living who replaced them, who kept coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail month after month, year after year. McNamara was not a foolish man. He had begun to suspect that something was wrong with the information he was receiving. The optimistic reports from Saigon did not match the pessimistic assessments from the CIA. The success metrics did not translate into political progress in South Vietnam or strategic advantage in the region. The enemy, who should have been collapsing under the weight of American firepower, showed no signs of breaking. In early 1967, McNamara commissioned a secret study of American involvement in Vietnam, a comprehensive review of decision-making that would eventually become known as the Pentagon Papers. He wanted to understand how the United States had arrived at its current position, what assumptions had driven policy, whether mistakes had been made. It was the action of a man beginning to doubt. But McNamara's doubts remained private. In public, before Congress and the press, he continued to express confidence in the war's progress. He had helped create the machinery of optimism, and he could not dismantle it without admitting that the strategy he had championed was failing. The political costs were too high. The president needed good news. The country needed to believe. The architecture of deception that McNamara inhabited was not of his sole construction. It had been built over years, layer by layer, until it had become almost impenetrable. At the base were the field reports, the raw data from units in contact with the enemy. Here, the first distortions entered. Company commanders reported body counts that reflected not what they had confirmed, but what they estimated, or hoped, or needed to report to satisfy battalion. Weapons captured were counted multiple times as they moved through the intelligence system. Villages marked as pacified were villages where American troops had passed through, regardless of what happened after they left. These reports flowed upward to battalion, then brigade, then division. At each level, they were aggregated, summarized, and subtly adjusted. Commanders added context that softened bad news and amplified good news. Intelligence officers chose which data to highlight and which to minimize. Staff officers, knowing what their superiors wanted to hear, shaped their briefings accordingly. By the time the information reached Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters in Saigon, it had passed through so many filters that it bore only passing resemblance to ground truth. General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam, received daily briefings that painted a picture of steady progress. He had no reason to doubt these briefings. They came from his own staff, compiled by officers he trusted, supported by data that appeared rigorous and comprehensive. Westmoreland was a man of genuine ability. He had risen through the ranks, commanded the 101st Airborne Division, served as superintendent of West Point. He was intelligent, dedicated, and absolutely convinced that American firepower and mobility would eventually break the enemy's will. His conviction was not born of ignorance, but of a worldview shaped by his experience. He had seen American military power triumph in World War II and Korea. He could not imagine an enemy capable of absorbing such punishment indefinitely. This conviction shaped everything that flowed upward from his command. Reports that confirmed his assumptions were embraced. Reports that contradicted them were questioned, reinterpreted, or dismissed. It was not deliberate deception. It was the natural human tendency to see what one expects to see, to hear what one needs to hear. From Saigon, the filtered information traveled to Washington. Here it underwent further processing by civilian officials and military advisors who had their own institutional pressures. The president needed to maintain domestic support for the war. The State Department needed to reassure allies. The Pentagon needed to justify its budget requests. Everyone had reasons to emphasize the positive. The result was a feedback loop of false optimism. Commanders in the field reported progress to justify their operations. Their reports were aggregated into success metrics that justified the overall strategy. Those metrics were presented to political leaders who used them to justify continued investment in the war. And the political commitment, in turn, created pressure on commanders to report more progress. Breaking this cycle required someone with both the knowledge and the courage to speak truth to power. It required officers willing to sacrifice their careers for honesty. It required political leaders willing to hear bad news. It required a press willing to challenge official narratives. All of these existed in Vietnam, scattered throughout the system like seeds waiting to germinate. But the soil of institutional culture was hostile to their growth. The officers who tried to break through faced obstacles at every turn. Colonel David Hackworth was one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam War. He had earned 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 10 Silver Stars, and 8 Bronze Stars. He commanded a battalion of the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, and his unit was among the most effective in the theater. His credentials were unimpeachable. But Hackworth also saw what the official reports refused to acknowledge. He saw that search and destroy operations were achieving tactical successes without strategic progress. He saw that the enemy controlled the tempo of the war, choosing when and where to fight. He saw that pacification programs were failing, that the rural population remained alienated, that the South Vietnamese government was incapable of winning the loyalty of its own people. When Hackworth tried to report these observations through official channels, he found the same institutional resistance that had silenced John Paul Vann. His assessments were unwelcome. His suggestions for alternative strategies were ignored. The system was not designed to accommodate fundamental criticism. It was designed to optimize existing approaches. Years later, Hackworth would describe his experience in an interview that shocked the military establishment. He spoke of officers who knew the war was being lost, but refused to say so publicly. He described a culture of careerism that prioritized personal advancement over honest assessment. He accused the military leadership of deceiving the American people about the true state of the war. By then, of course, it was too late. The war was already lost. The Central Intelligence Agency represented a parallel stream of information that sometimes contradicted the military's optimism. CIA analysts, less invested in the success of military operations, often provided more pessimistic assessments of enemy strength and political progress. Their estimates of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces consistently ran higher than military estimates. Their assessments of the South Vietnamese government's stability were consistently bleaker. In 1967, this conflict came to a head in a battle over enemy order of battle estimates. The military command in Saigon estimated total enemy strength at around 290,000. The CIA estimated it at over 500,000, including irregular forces and political cadre that the military did not count. The difference was not merely numerical, it had profound implications for strategy and progress assessment. If the CIA was right, then the attrition strategy that Westmoreland championed was nowhere near the crossover point. The enemy had reserves that American firepower had barely touched. The debate was eventually resolved, not by evidence, but by bureaucratic pressure. CIA analysts were pressured to lower their estimates. The military's numbers, which supported the narrative of progress, prevailed. The truth was sacrificed to institutional consensus. Sam Adams was one of the CIA analysts who fought this battle and lost. He had spent years studying enemy strength, developing methodologies for counting forces that the military preferred to ignore. When his estimates were suppressed, he tried to go through official channels. When that failed, he considered leaking to the press. He watched in anguish as the official estimates, which he knew to be wrong, were presented to Congress and the public as authoritative assessments. Adams would later testify before Congress about the order of battle controversy. He would write a book documenting the suppression of intelligence. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain how the best-informed government in the world could have been so wrong about so fundamental a fact. The answer was not that the information did not exist. The answer was that the system filtered out information that contradicted established narratives. The machinery of assessment was designed to confirm, not to question. And so the silence persisted. Even as the evidence mounted, even as the bodies came home, even as the war that could not be won continued to be fought. Khe Sanh Combat Base, January 1968. The fog hung low over the hills, reducing visibility to meters. Somewhere in that fog, 20,000 North Vietnamese army soldiers were digging trenches, positioning artillery, preparing for an assault that American intelligence had predicted but could not prevent. Inside the base, 6,000 Marines waited in bunkers reinforced against the bombardment that came every day, sometimes every hour. Colonel David Lowndes commanded the defense of Khe Sanh. He was a career Marine, veteran of Korea, experienced in the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. He studied his maps and calculated his ammunition consumption and requested air support and did everything a competent commander should do. But in quiet moments, alone in his command bunker, he wondered what victory at Khe Sanh would actually mean. The base sat in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam near the Laotian border, ostensibly blocking infiltration routes from the north. But the enemy had already demonstrated that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single path to be blocked. It was a network of roads and trails stretching through hundreds of miles of jungle, capable of absorbing any interdiction effort. Holding Khe Sanh would not stop the flow of men and material southward. It would simply force that flow to find alternate routes. More troubling still was the strategic context. American intelligence believed that Khe Sanh was meant to be a diversion, fixing American attention on the remote northwest while the enemy prepared a larger offensive elsewhere. This assessment proved correct when, on January 30th, Communist forces launched coordinated attacks on cities throughout South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive that would transform the war. But even knowing this, even understanding that Khe Sanh was a strategic distraction, American commanders could not abandon the base. The political symbolism was too powerful. President Johnson had become personally invested in holding Khe Sanh, comparing it to Dien Bien Phu, the siege where French colonial forces had been decisively defeated in 1954. To abandon Khe Sanh would be to admit that America was following the same path as France toward defeat, and so 6,000 Marines remained in their bunkers, absorbing bombardment, waiting for an assault that might or might not come, fighting for a position that their commanders privately doubted was worth the cost. They fought bravely, professionally, achieving tactical success in every engagement. But tactical success in pursuit of a flawed strategy is not victory. It is only postponement of inevitable failure. The siege of Khe Sanh lasted 77 days. American forces successfully defended the base, inflicting massive casualties on the attacking North Vietnamese. Then, 3 months after the siege was lifted, American commanders quietly abandoned Khe Sanh. The position that had been worth 6,000 Marine lives to defend was dismantled and left to the jungle. The Marines who survived Khe Sanh understood something that the official histories would take decades to acknowledge. They had fought and died not for strategic necessity but for political theater. Their courage had been spent not to win the war, but to maintain the appearance that the war could be won. This knowledge, carried silently by thousands of veterans, was perhaps the heaviest burden of the Vietnam War. The men who fought knew things that their leaders refused to say publicly. They saw the gap between official narrative and ground truth. They experienced the consequences of strategies designed more for domestic politics than military effectiveness. Captain Brian Jenkins served as an Army Special Forces officer in Vietnam during 1966 and 1967. His mission was to train and lead indigenous forces in the Central Highlands, conducting reconnaissance and interdiction operations against North Vietnamese infiltration routes. He was good at his job, effective in combat, trusted by the Vietnamese and Montagnard soldiers he commanded. But Jenkins also kept his eyes open. He studied the enemy with the analytical intensity of someone who might have to fight them tomorrow. And what he saw did not match the optimistic assessments flowing back to Washington. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were not breaking. Despite losses that should have been catastrophic, they maintained their organizational coherence and fighting capability. New recruits replaced the fallen. Weapons lost in combat were replaced by supplies flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The enemy's will to fight showed no signs of weakening. More disturbing was what Jenkins observed about the South Vietnamese government and military. After years of American support, after billions of dollars in aid and training, the fundamental problems remained. Corruption was endemic. Political legitimacy was absent. The army that was supposed to take over the fight as Americans withdrew was not becoming capable of doing so. Jenkins returned to the United States and eventually became one of the first analysts at the Rand Corporation to study terrorism and insurgency. He brought to that work the knowledge he had gained in Vietnam, that military power alone cannot defeat a motivated insurgency, that political factors often trump tactical superiority, that the will to persist matters more than the ability to destroy. These insights were not unique to Jenkins. Hundreds of officers who served in Vietnam reached similar conclusions. They wrote them in after-action reports that were filed and forgotten. They discussed them in staff meetings where they were noted and ignored. They carried them in their memories as they rose through the ranks or left the service in frustration. The officers who stayed silent did so for many reasons. Some feared for their careers. Some hoped that strategic adjustments would solve the problems they observed. Some simply could not believe that the system they served was capable of such fundamental error. The institutional culture of the military made dissent almost unthinkable. Major General William Dupuy commanded the 1st Infantry Division during some of the war's heaviest fighting. He was an architect of the search and destroy strategy, a true believer in the application of firepower to achieve attrition. Under his command, the Big Red One conducted operations that killed thousands of enemy soldiers, achieving body count ratios that looked impressive in statistical summaries. But Dupuy was also an honest man, capable of learning from experience. As his tour progressed, he began to recognize the limitations of his approach. The enemy absorbed losses and kept fighting. The pacification programs that were supposed to follow military operations failed to materialize or collapsed after American forces moved on. The victory that always seemed just over the horizon never arrived. After leaving Vietnam, Dupuy became one of the architects of military reform. He helped create the Training and Doctrine Command, which transformed how the army prepared for war. He wrote doctrine that emphasized maneuver and combined arms rather than attrition. He tried to ensure that the next generation of officers would not repeat the mistakes he had witnessed. But during the war itself, Dupuy did not publicly challenge the strategy he had helped implement. He reported progress because progress was expected. He optimized the tactics available to him rather than questioning the strategy those tactics served. His silence was the silence of a professional soldier doing his duty within a flawed system. The pressure to remain silent extended beyond career concerns. There was also the weight of responsibility for the men who served under these officers. To publicly declare that the war was unwinnable while soldiers continued to fight and die was to tell those soldiers that their sacrifices were meaningless. No commander wanted to bear that burden. It was easier to maintain hope, to believe that one more operation might turn the tide, to trust that the leaders above must know something that justified the continued struggle. This psychological pressure created a peculiar form of collective denial. Officers who privately doubted the war's prospects maintained public optimism to preserve morale. Their subordinates, taking cues from their commanders, did the same. The result was an army that fought with determination and skill, while its leadership harbored unspoken doubts about the purpose of that fighting. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 cracked this facade of confidence, though it did not destroy it entirely. The attacks came as a strategic surprise, despite intelligence warnings that had been circulating for weeks. Communist forces struck simultaneously across South Vietnam, hitting military installations, provincial capitals, and even the American embassy in Saigon. In purely military terms, the offensive was a defeat for the attackers. They suffered enormous casualties, lost much of their political infrastructure in the south, and failed to achieve their apparent objective of sparking a general uprising. But Tet achieved something more important than military success. It shattered the credibility of official optimism. The American public, which had been assured for years that the war was being won, watched on television as enemy sappers fought inside the embassy compound. The progress that had been promised was exposed as illusion. The light at the end of the tunnel was revealed to be an oncoming train. For the officers who had known the truth, Tet was a moment of bitter vindication. The warnings they had tried to give, the assessments that had been ignored, were suddenly confirmed in the most dramatic possible way. The system that had suppressed their doubts was exposed as fundamentally broken. If this story is touching something inside you, leave a comment right now saying the truth should never have been silenced. I want to know if you're feeling the weight of what these men carried in silence. But vindication offered no comfort. Too many had died while the truth was suppressed. Too many would continue to die in the years that followed Tet, as the war dragged on for another 7 years. The officers who knew had been right, but their knowledge had not prevented the catastrophe. It had only ensured that they understood, with terrible clarity, what was being lost. The Tet offensive created space for dissent that had not existed before. Journalists who had accepted official briefings began questioning them aggressively. Members of Congress who had supported the war started calling for withdrawal. Even within the military, voices that had been silenced began to speak. General Frederick Wyand had commanded forces that successfully defended Saigon during Tet. He had repositioned his troops based on intelligence that the offensive was coming, despite pressure from Westmoreland's headquarters to maintain deployments that supported ongoing offensive operations. His foresight had prevented a disaster that could have been far worse. After Tet, Wyand was more willing to express his doubts about the war's trajectory. He understood that the military situation, however favorable it might appear in statistical terms, was disconnected from the political realities that would determine the war's outcome. South Vietnam was not becoming capable of defending itself. The American public was not willing to sustain the commitment indefinitely. Time was on the enemy's side, but even Wyand's more candid assessments remained within institutional boundaries. He advocated for strategic adjustments, not fundamental reappraisal. He worked within the system rather than challenging its premises. The silence had loosened, but it had not broken. Washington, D.C., early 1971. Daniel Ellsberg sat in his apartment, surrounded by boxes of classified documents. He had spent months secretly photocopying the Pentagon Papers, the comprehensive study that Robert McNamara had commissioned years earlier. Now he faced the most consequential decision of his life. Ellsberg had once been a true believer. He had served in Vietnam as a State Department official, walking through villages with a carbine, taking notes on pacification programs. He had worked at RAND, analyzing strategy and tactics with the detachment of an academic. He had believed that the war could be won with the right approach, the right policies, the right leadership. That belief had died slowly, killed by accumulated evidence that no approach would work, because the fundamental premise was flawed. The United States was fighting to preserve a government that could not command the loyalty of its own people. No amount of military success could compensate for that political failure. The Pentagon Papers documented how American leaders had known this for years. They showed the gap between public statements and private assessments. They revealed decisions made not for strategic reasons, but for domestic political convenience. They proved, with the authority of internal government documents, what critics had been saying all along. The war had been built on lies. Ellsberg understood what would happen if he released these documents. He would face prosecution under the Espionage Act. He would be branded a traitor by many who had supported the war. His career, his reputation, his freedom itself would be sacrificed. but he also understood what would happen if he remained silent. The war would continue. More Americans would die, more Vietnamese would die, and the lies that had enabled this destruction would remain hidden, protected by classification stamps and institutional silence. The decision was not easy, but in the end it was clear. The truth had to come out. The public had a right to know what had been done in their name. The silence of so many others made it necessary for someone to speak. Ellsberg gave the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, which began publishing them in June 1971. The Nixon administration sought an injunction to stop publication, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press. The documents became public, and the architecture of deception was exposed for all to see. Ellsberg was indeed prosecuted under the Espionage Act. He faced potential imprisonment of over a century. But government misconduct during the trial, including the burglary of his psychiatrist's office by operatives later connected to Watergate, led to the dismissal of all charges. He spent the rest of his life advocating for transparency and against unnecessary secrecy. The Pentagon Papers did not end the war, but they fundamentally changed the public's understanding of how the war had been conducted. They validated what skeptics had long suspected, that the official narrative was not merely optimistic, but deliberately misleading. They created a template for accountability that echoed through subsequent decades. But Ellsberg was exceptional. Most officers who knew the truth did not follow his path. They could not bring themselves to violate their oaths, betray their institutions, risk everything they had built. Their silence continued even as the evidence mounted. John Paul Vann returned to Vietnam in 1965, this time as a civilian advisor with the Agency for International Development. He had left the army, frustrated by the institutional barriers to honest reporting. But he could not stay away from the war that had consumed his life. Back in Vietnam, Vann resumed his crusade for honest assessment. He developed relationships with journalists, providing them with information that contradicted official briefings. He challenged generals in meetings, pressing them on inconsistencies in their reports. He became known as the most informed and most critical American in the war zone. Vann's persistence eventually earned him a position of authority. By 1972, he was the senior American advisor in Military Region 2, commanding general equivalent rank despite his civilian status. He finally had the power he had sought to implement the strategies he believed could work. But the war was already lost by then. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 provided for American withdrawal, leaving South Vietnam to face North Vietnam alone. Vann did not live to see the final collapse. He died in a helicopter crash in June 1972, still fighting for a cause he had known for a decade was probably hopeless. Vann's story illustrates the tragedy of those who tried to break the silence. His assessments were eventually validated, his criticisms proven correct, but validation came too late to change the outcome. The institutional resistance that had marginalized him in 1963 maintained its grip throughout the war. By the time the system acknowledged its errors, the errors had already extracted their terrible cost. The officers who remained within the system and tried to change it from inside faced their own frustrations. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert was one of the most decorated soldiers in the war, a battalion commander with a reputation for aggressive action and personal courage. But Herbert also observed war crimes committed by American forces, atrocities that violated the laws of armed conflict and the values the military claimed to uphold. When Herbert reported these crimes through official channels, he found the same resistance that had silenced strategic critics. His superiors were not interested in documenting American misconduct. The crimes he reported were investigated perfunctorily and dismissed. His persistence marked him as a troublemaker. Herbert's career was destroyed not by the enemy, but by his own institution. He was relieved of command, given negative efficiency reports, and effectively forced out of the army. When he later went public with his allegations, he was attacked by the military establishment, his credibility questioned, his record re-examined for any flaw that could discredit him. The message was unmistakable. The same silence that protected strategic illusions also protected institutional misconduct. Speaking truth to power was professionally fatal, regardless of what truth was being spoken. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Officers who challenged the narrative, whether on strategic grounds or moral ones, found their careers terminated and their reputations attacked. The institution protected itself by destroying those who questioned it. Colonel Harry Summers served in Vietnam and later wrote one of the most influential analyses of the war's failure. His book on strategy argued that American military leadership had misunderstood the nature of the conflict, focusing on counterinsurgency when the real enemy was conventional North Vietnamese forces. His critique was sharp, informed by deep knowledge of military theory and personal experience. But Summers' analysis, valuable as it was, appeared only after the war was over. During the conflict itself, he had served within the system, doing his duty as assigned, not publicly challenging the strategy he later criticized. Like so many others, he found it easier to speak after the fact than in the moment when speech might have mattered. The war created a generation of officers scarred by what they had witnessed and participated in. Many left the service, unable to reconcile their experiences with the institution's self-image. Those who stayed often dedicated themselves to reform, determined to ensure that the mistakes of Vietnam would not be repeated. General Colin Powell was a young officer in Vietnam, serving 2 tours and witnessing firsthand the dysfunction that characterized American operations. He rose through the ranks to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, bringing with him lessons learned in the jungles and villages of Southeast Asia. The Powell Doctrine, which emphasized clear objectives, overwhelming force, and exit strategies before committing American forces, was a direct response to Vietnam's failures. It represented an institutional attempt to prevent future quagmires, to ensure that military force would not again be committed to ambiguous missions without the resources and political will necessary for success. But the Powell Doctrine also illustrated the limits of institutional learning. It addressed the symptoms of Vietnam, the inadequate resources and unclear objectives, without fully engaging the deeper problem of honest assessment. The military learned to demand better conditions before going to war. It did not fully learn to acknowledge when wars were being lost. Saigon, April 30th, 1975. The last helicopter lifted off from the American embassy roof as North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets below. The evacuation had been chaotic, desperate, marked by scenes that would haunt American memory for decades. Vietnamese allies clinging to helicopter skids, embassy staff destroying classified documents, the South Vietnamese government collapsing in hours after years of American support. For the officers who had known, who had spent years trying to tell the truth and failing, this moment was the culmination of everything they had feared. The war they had warned could not be won had ended in exactly the manner they had predicted. The lives lost, American and Vietnamese, had been sacrificed for an outcome that honest assessment would have recognized as inevitable years earlier. The fall of Saigon was not merely a military defeat. It was the collapse of a narrative, the final destruction of the illusion that had sustained American involvement for over a decade. All the optimistic assessments, all the progress reports, all the light at the end of the tunnel rhetoric were exposed as fantasy. The enemy that was supposed to be on the verge of collapse had triumphed completely. In the aftermath, recriminations flew in every direction. Military leaders blamed civilian politicians for imposing constraints that prevented victory. Politicians blamed military leaders for providing unrealistic assessments and requesting resources that could not be justified. The press was accused of undermining public support. The anti-war movement was accused of encouraging the enemy. Everyone had someone else to blame. But among those who had served in Vietnam, who had seen the gap between reality and rhetoric, there was a quieter reckoning. They knew that the failure was not the fault of any single group, but of a system that had prevented honest assessment at every level. They had been part of that system. They had contributed to its failures, sometimes through active deception, more often through passive silence. This knowledge shaped the post-Vietnam military in profound ways. The officer corps that emerged from Vietnam was determined to never again fight a war it could not win. The reforms of the 1970s and 1980s transformed American military doctrine, training, and organization. The creation of the all-volunteer force eliminated the draft resistance that had contributed to domestic opposition. The development of new weapon systems provided capabilities that had been lacking in Vietnam. The revision of doctrine emphasized maneuver and combined arms rather than the attrition that had failed in Southeast Asia. But the deeper problem, the institutional suppression of honest assessment, proved more resistant to reform. General H.R. McMaster, who would later serve as National Security Advisor, wrote a doctoral dissertation that became the definitive study of how the silence had developed. His book, Dereliction of Duty, examined the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the early years of Vietnam, documenting how military leaders had failed to provide honest advice to civilian policymakers and had acquiesced in decisions they knew were flawed. McMaster's thesis was damning. The military leadership of the Vietnam era had failed in its fundamental duty to provide honest counsel. They had told the president what he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. They had prioritized institutional interests over national interests. They had remained silent when speaking might have changed the course of history. But McMaster also recognized the institutional pressures that had produced this failure. The military leaders of the Vietnam era were not uniquely weak or dishonest. They operated within a system that discouraged dissent, that rewarded optimism, that made truth-telling professionally dangerous. The failure was cultural as much as personal. The question of whether these lessons were truly learned remains open. The wars that followed Vietnam suggest that the institutional tendency toward optimistic assessment persists. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the same patterns emerged. Progress metrics that measured activity rather than achievement, optimistic briefings that contradicted ground truth, critics marginalized and careers ended. The specific circumstances differed, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis served in Afghanistan and publicly challenged the official narrative of progress in that war. His assessment, based on extensive travel throughout the country and conversations with troops at all levels, contradicted the optimistic reports being provided to Congress and the public. He described a war that was not being won, an Afghan government that could not sustain itself, an enemy that remained capable despite years of American operations. Davis' experience echoed that of Vietnam-era critics. His assessment was unwelcome. His career suffered. The system responded to his challenge not by engaging with his arguments, but by questioning his motives and credentials. The institutional immune response to honest assessment remained powerful decades after Vietnam. The officers who had served in Vietnam and survived to become senior leaders tried to prevent this repetition. Some succeeded in specific instances. Others found the institutional pressures too strong to overcome. The culture of optimism, the career incentives that rewarded good news, the political demands for progress, all remained powerful forces that shaped what information flowed upward and what was filtered out. Perhaps the most important legacy of Vietnam's silence was the recognition that the problem was systemic rather than individual. The officers who failed to speak were not cowards or fools. They were products of an institution that made silence rational. Changing the outcome would require changing the institution itself. This recognition led to reforms in how the military gathers and processes intelligence, how commanders are held accountable for honest reporting, how dissent is protected and encouraged. Progress has been made, though whether it has been sufficient remains unclear. The veterans of Vietnam, those who knew and remained silent, and those who tried to speak and were silenced, carried their knowledge into civilian life and into retirement and ultimately into history. Some wrote memoirs that documented what they had witnessed. Some testified before Congress about the gap between reality and rhetoric. Some spent decades trying to understand how such a catastrophic failure had been possible. Their testimonies form a collective record of institutional failure, a warning to future generations about the dangers of suppressing honest assessment. Whether that warning will be heeded remains the open question of American military history. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Washington, D.C., present day. The black granite wall stretches across the mall, inscribed with 58,320 names. They are arranged chronologically, beginning with the first American deaths in 1959 and ending with the last in 1975. Visitors trace their fingers across the carved letters, make rubbings on paper, leave flowers and flags and photographs. The wall reflects the faces of the living who come to remember the dead. For those who knew the truth during the war, who understood that victory was impossible and remained silent, this memorial carries a weight beyond grief. Each name represents not just a life lost, but a question. Could this death have been prevented? If the truth had been spoken earlier, if the institutional barriers to honest assessment had been overcome, if the political courage had existed to acknowledge failure, how many of these names would never have been carved? There is no way to answer this question with certainty. The counterfactuals of history are inherently speculative. Perhaps earlier, honesty would have led to earlier withdrawal and fewer American deaths. Perhaps it would have led to different strategies that might have succeeded. Perhaps the political dynamics of the Cold War would have prevented any course correction regardless of what officers reported. The silence was not the only cause of the tragedy, merely one cause among many. But the question persists, haunting those who lived through the war and those who study it today. The officers who knew and did not speak must live with the knowledge that their silence, however rational from a career perspective, contributed to outcomes that cost lives. That is a burden that no medal can honor and no retirement can ease. The lessons of Vietnam's silence extend far beyond military affairs. Every large institution faces the same challenge: how to ensure that honest assessment flows upward, that bad news reaches decision-makers, that the human tendency to hear only what we want to hear is counteracted by structures that reward truth-telling. The military is not unique in failing this challenge. Corporations suppress warnings about product defects. Government agencies minimize risks that might threaten their budgets. Medical systems ignore evidence that contradicts established protocols. The dynamics that silenced Vietnam's critics operate wherever hierarchies exist and careers depend on pleasing superiors. Understanding how these dynamics work is the first step toward overcoming them. The officers who remained silent in Vietnam were not uniquely flawed. They were responding to incentives that made silence rational. Changing the incentives, creating cultures where dissent is valued rather than punished, establishing channels for honest assessment that bypass normal hierarchies, these are the structural reforms that might prevent future failures. Some progress has been made. Intelligence agencies have developed red team processes that deliberately challenge consensus assessments. Military commands have inspector general functions that provide independent evaluation. Whistleblower protections, imperfect as they are, offer some shield for those who speak uncomfortable truths, but the fundamental tension remains. Institutions need optimism to function. Pessimism undermines morale and commitment. Leaders need to inspire confidence. Doubt is corrosive of authority. The human need to believe that our sacrifices have meaning resists the recognition that they may have been in vain. These are not problems that can be solved with policy reforms. They are permanent features of human psychology and organizational behavior. The story of Vietnam's silence is ultimately a story about the limits of good intentions. The officers who remained silent were not evil. Many were dedicated professionals who had devoted their lives to service. They believed they were doing their duty, supporting their institution, maintaining morale in difficult circumstances. Their silence emerged not from malice, but from a system that made truth-telling appear irresponsible. This makes the lesson more troubling, not less. If silence can emerge from good intentions, from institutional loyalty, from the reasonable calculation of career incentives, then it can emerge again. It has emerged again in subsequent conflicts in other institutions, wherever the pressure to conform overwhelms the obligation to speak honestly. The officers who did speak, who sacrificed careers and reputations to tell the truth, deserve recognition for their courage. John Paul Vann, who fought the system until his death. Daniel Ellsberg, who risked imprisonment to expose the lies. David Hackworth, who went public with his criticisms at the cost of his standing. The countless others, less famous, who tried to speak and were silenced, who documented truths that were ignored, who carried their knowledge as a private burden. These individuals could not change the outcome. The institutional forces arrayed against them were too powerful. But they created a record, a testimony that future generations could study and learn from. They demonstrated that resistance was possible, even if not successful. They preserved their integrity in circumstances that made integrity costly. The contrast between those who spoke and those who remained silent offers no easy moral lessons. The speakers were not uniformly heroic. Some had personal motives mixed with principled ones. The silent were not uniformly cowardly. Many faced genuine dilemmas with no good options. The line between prudent discretion and culpable silence is often unclear in the moment, visible only in retrospect. What is clear is that the collective silence of so many who knew contributed to a catastrophe that might have been mitigated, if not prevented. The war lasted longer than it needed to. More died than had to die. The eventual defeat was more complete, more traumatic, more damaging to American credibility and Vietnamese lives than it might have been with earlier honesty. This is the weight that the wall carries. Not just the names of the dead, but the questions about how they died and whether it was necessary. The memorial does not answer these questions. It simply makes them impossible to avoid. Every visitor who traces a name with their finger is implicitly asking, how did this happen? Could it have been different? The officers who knew and remained silent are mostly gone now, claimed by age and time. Their knowledge died with them. Except for what they left in memoirs and testimonies and interviews, the generation that fought Vietnam is passing from living memory into history. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to know the truth and not be able to speak it, but the lessons they left behind remain relevant. The institutional dynamics that produced the silence of Vietnam persist in every large organization. The tension between honest assessment and career advancement exists wherever hierarchies exist. The human tendency to believe what we want to believe remains the most persistent obstacle to good decision-making. Understanding Vietnam's silence is not merely an exercise in historical analysis. It is preparation for the future, for the inevitable moments when institutions will again pressure individuals to suppress inconvenient truths. Those who study this history are better equipped to recognize those pressures and resist them. They understand that silence has costs, that the price of institutional loyalty can be measured in lives. The veterans who come to the wall know this. They see their faces reflected in the black granite alongside the names of their fallen comrades. They remember what they knew and what they said and what they did not say. They carry that knowledge as their final burden, the weight of a war that did not have to be fought so long, that did not have to cost so much, that did not have to end the way it did. The truth that was silenced in Vietnam echoes still. It echoes in the training programs that teach young officers to challenge flawed assumptions. It echoes in the intelligence reforms that seek to prevent groupthink. It echoes in the memorials that force us to count the cost of political and military failure. It echoes in every conversation about how institutions can be structured to reward honesty rather than punish it. And it echoes in the simple question that every officer must eventually answer: when you knew the truth, did you speak it? The wall has no answer. It only has names, 58,320 of them, carved in black granite, waiting for those who come to remember. The fog still rises over the Mekong Delta. The jungle has reclaimed the fire bases. The tunnels of Cu Chi are now tourist attractions. The war that once consumed American attention has faded into history, displaced by new conflicts and new concerns. But history is not past. It is prologue. The patterns that produced Vietnam's tragedy remain embedded in human institutions. The officers who will face the next impossible war are being trained today. The system that will pressure them to report progress rather than reality is already in place. The silence that cost so many lives is always ready to descend again. The only defense against that silence is memory. Memory of what happened and why. Memory of those who spoke and those who did not. Memory of the cost extracted when truth is suppressed and illusion maintained. This is why the stories must be told, why the testimonies must be preserved, why the lessons must be passed from generation to generation. The officers who knew victory in Vietnam was impossible but did not dare to say it were not monsters. They were human beings, caught in systems that made honesty dangerous and silence safe. Understanding their failure is the first step toward ensuring it is not repeated. The war ended 50 years ago. The questions it raised remain unanswered. The silence that enabled it remains a warning, and the wall, black and reflective, continues to bear witness to what was lost. If you watched this far, it's because this story moved something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really values these stories that reveal what history often hides. If this video touched you, leave your like and share it with someone who also appreciates the weight of truth. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. These are the stories that matter, told with the depth they deserve.